If you think of the autonomous car, you're going to have decisions made by machines as to what they do in certain circumstances, very difficult circumstances. If there's choice between killing one set of people or another set of people, if you get into a position where you can't avoid a collision, do you run over the crowd in front of you, or does the machine kill the driver? If you're a driver, you would take that split-second decision as a human being, but if you're in a driverless vehicle, you might have to actually program that in. So I don't see a way of doing that programming without an ethical dimension.
Welcome to Uprising. Each episode looks inside what it takes to lead the most dynamic and successful cultural movements. Some of them in the business world, some in the social realm, some in politics, and some in between, to see why people start uprisings. What gives those initiatives momentum and keeps them going? And most important, what lessons can you learn from these movements and how to apply them to your business and even personal life? Let's explore the secret to sparking movements that move people into action.
Passionate ideas.
Controversial ideas.
Uprising ideas.
The power is now in the hands of anyone.
To start a cultural movement.
Today's Uprising Pod is brought to you by warbyparker.com. Get a free 5-day home try-on at www.warbyparkertrial.com/uprising. 5 pairs, 5 days, 100% free.
Close your eyes and imagine the year is 2050. What is it like? What do you see? What movements will form as a result of technological change? Perhaps everyone walks around with glasses that project every message, every update right in your view, in your eyes. Maybe it's artificial intelligence, robots sprinkled among the masses, completing tasks we now consider menial or everyday. Perhaps your 2050 is desolate, completely taken over by the machine. Climate is hot and barren, and there's no one around. Our guest today to the Uprising Pod attempts to explore this foreign, far-off world in the book Megatech, Technology in 2050. Please welcome Executive Editor of The Economist, Daniel Franklin. Thank you for joining us from London.
Thank you. Well, it's good to be with you.
So you open your book by writing, it is impossible to know for sure what the technology of 2050 will be. Just as 30 years ago, nobody could have envisioned today's world of Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google. How would you describe today's tech world?
I think it's an extraordinary tech world. I mean, certainly when I compare it to my youth, the very fact that we can be having this conversation over something called Skype, essentially free, you in New York, me in London, we could be doing it over a video link. We happen to be doing it just over audio, but it's made communication extraordinarily easy. And a colleague of mine a few years ago wrote a prediction that we were going to see the death of distance. So that's one extraordinary thing. And then we've just been marking the 10th anniversary of the iPhone. And that is extraordinary change that we essentially all carry around, whether it's an iPhone or another type of smartphone, carry around with us a device that can connect you with virtually the entire body of human knowledge ever. It's amazing.
Are you worried that the infrastructure of civilization as we kind of know it, or what we grew up with, is also being wiped out by this technology? We celebrate the iPhone, and it does what you said. It reduces distances, and it gives us tremendous power in the hand. But at the same time, it feels as though we're living in a time where there's these huge shifts going on, and it's almost they're happening without our awareness.
Yes, I don't think I worry that civilization is being wiped out, but I do worry that the speed with which this is happening and is likely to continue to happen presents us with a lot of challenges in adapting to it and working out the best way to use the possibilities that are being created, and in treating it responsibly and coping with some of the consequences that it produces. So it's not always easy, but I think overwhelmingly my sense is of excitement of what the possibilities created are.
What is the the ideal human for this world where change seems to be constant and fast and rapid, and there doesn't ever seem to be time to contemplate anything anymore.
Yes, I think that's a fair point, that actually space and time to do proper reflection, to really absorb and think more deeply than we often seem to have the opportunity to do in our regular lives is something very precious and will increasingly be valued as we're bombarded by more and more sort of constant information around us. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that I like the stepping back approach of peering into the far off horizon of, take 2050 as a kind of metaphor for looking beyond the immediate horizon, because I think that does help to, or encourages a way of thinking that looks beyond the hubbub of today and says, well, what are the really big trends happening? What are the really big changes happening in front of us?
It's fascinating. I mean, to think back 50 years from today and how, for example, computers, the sophistication of computers 50 years ago and today, how intelligent they've become. It's almost unbelievable. From bacteria to Einstein, and from computers in 1980, whenever it is, 50 years ago to today, it's a tremendous leap forward.
Yes, and of course you can't know for sure where this is going to take us in the decades ahead, but I think starting to think about what sorts of changes might be happening can be both very interesting and sometimes quite helpful in what we see as important to prepare for.
In your book, you talk about that, about pausing and looking into the future, but you also talk about looking back in history, and that history repeats itself. What does looking at the past technological advancements tell us about where we're going?
Well, I think it's important to say that history doesn't repeat itself absolutely. It's not a carbon copy of the future, but you can look for lessons or patterns from the past that can help you put today and what's likely to happen next in perspective. So actually, this is, perhaps we should have stressed at the beginning, this is not all my writing. This is very much very clever people that I've invited to contribute to this book, 20 essays, essentially. And the very first of these essays, by my colleague here at The Economist, Tom Standage, offers a toolkit for looking at the future. And just 3 items in the toolkit. One is trend watching, another is science fiction, actually. But the very first item in his toolkit is lessons from history. And you could look, for example, at driverless cars if you're trying to work out, well, what is likely to happen? What sort of issues are we likely to encounter as driverless cars develop? An obvious place to look is at the transition from horse-drawn carriages to horseless carriages to automotive vehicles. And actually, you see a lot of the same sorts of issues that are cropping up now being grappled with then. There was a mass labor force that depended on all that infrastructure. There were concerns about the new infrastructure that would have to be created, certainly safety concerns as well, which is obviously the prime thing for driverless cars, worries about regulations, what's the correct form of regulations, more or less everything there. So I think it's instructive to look back and think, how might this play out? Similarly, some of the things I think you were alluding to earlier, kind of concerns about the impact of new technology. There's a pattern historically of moral panics around new technologies, that technologies are kind of destroying our way of life in some way and are going to damage our society in ways that are going to be very hard to cope with. So, people worried about novels and the effect that they would have on morals. People worried when talking movies came out, they worried about the effect of that. And they worried about when computer games starting to come out, the effect of that. And now the impact of perhaps virtual reality. So we can expect that there will be these moral panics, and perhaps those who are offering these services could get ahead of the game and start to anticipate the kind of reaction that's going to be had.
The idea of being in a world where we become surpassed by software, where software is becoming so intelligent that we can't even relate to how it thinks or its reason for being. A dreamer's fantasy of the future could be beautiful. It could also, like Elon Musk talks about it, it's a dangerous future. It's almost like the chimpanzee is one evolutionary step below humans, and when machines become as smart as humans and then surpass that, like, do we become the chimpanzee? And will we know that we are?
Maybe we won't know. Well, I think certainly the machines do become better at certain tasks than we are, that's for sure. And I think a kind of seminal moment in that was a computer, or the DeepMind beating the world champion at Go, which was even harder, much by some orders of magnitude harder than beating the world champion at chess. And it's an illustration, very, very striking illustration, how certain particular tasks, and the computers are just getting better and better at this, they will outperform humans. But that doesn't mean that they outsmart us in other ways or surpass us in all sorts of other ways of understanding. And I think we can find new ways of working, as we already do, in all sorts of ways with the machines, to use machines to augment our human capabilities, and it doesn't make us redundant as human beings. I think there are concerns about very legitimate concerns about how far this goes, and what happens when if machines in certain situations could get out of control, or could start doing things that could be quite harmful, and how you allow for that, how you regulate that and minimize those dangers.
I enjoy meaningful relationships with human beings and find them stimulating.
Technology, could become a blessing and it could become a curse, but it also already is in some respects. As it always has been. My grandfather and his brother actually invented back in the early 1900s one of the first flat records. They were British, and then record industry took off, and then it was television, and when I was a kid, my parents used to complain about me watching television. Now, my kids are sucked into their phones, and I feel a lost connection to them. I find it incredibly frustrating. I find it super disruptive in terms of my ability to connect with them, and I have to text my son in order to have a dialogue with them. Yes. You must have the same experience. How do we overcome these types of changes that are happening?
Well, of course, it can be very disruptive, but then again, it's never been easy necessarily communicating with one's children. There have always been problems there, and maybe it puts a higher value on certain situations where you go on adventures of one form or another, where you have proper escape and no distractions from the normal, from machines or from other people. But I think it's just a change in the order of magnitude of some of these things, not the change in the essence. And there's still always a craving for human connection. I think it just sometimes happens in many, many different ways. We connect with each other in many different ways. It fascinates me how, despite the death of distance that I was talking about and the ease of telecommunication in all sorts of ways, there's still a great need for people seem to feel a great need to meet in person, and that has a different quality about it. So in a way, all these possibilities aren't either or, they come on top of one another, and you start to have different methods of communicating that live side by side. They don't replace older forms of communication.
I suppose if Bell would have invented texting, I'd be talking to my kids.
For you, the listeners of Scott Goodson's Uprising Pod, Warby Parker is offering a free 5-day home try-on to give you the opportunity to check out their glasses. To get your home try-on today, go to warbyparkertrial.com/uprising. Again, that's warbyparkertrial.com/uprising for your free 5-day home try-on.
So climate change is an interesting hot button, obviously, these days, especially with the current administration here in the United States. How will a new industrial technology revolution help or hurt the planet?
Well, I think if there is serious hope for doing something to minimize global warming and to control carbon emissions, it is not least technological. And in the energy area, for example, renewable energy is probably going to be one of the great exciting stories and growth areas of the coming decade. Solar power is coming down in price and improving in efficiency in leaps and bounds, and remarkable changes happening there. And there's probably more to come, more types of materials that will be used, more efficiency in those, not only in the capture of solar power, but also probably in its storage as well, which is one of the problems of renewable energy, that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So what you do to capture the energy and keep it for when you can't produce it at the same extent. And then I think the other area where technology can have a huge impact is just the efficiency with which data can be used to use existing energy much better and more cost effectively than has been the case in the past. And it's interesting that computer technology has been used already on somewhere as sophisticated as Google. You'd think they have enormous energy uses, but they applied some of their own DeepMind technology to work out more efficient use of their own their own centers, and they discovered that there were actually rather large efficiency gains that they could eke out by that very clever use of computing power.
It's interesting. There's a program at the Royal Academy of Technology in Stockholm, which is an English program that's significantly oversubscribed by very bright students from all over the place in Europe who want to get in on what you just described, like this new energy sources for the future. And I think younger people just intuitively know that they need to find solutions. I think that they don't have to be told; they just kind of lean into it. And so I think that your prediction there is accurate.
Well, and the other point about it is that this is something that is obviously, it's good because it's that has to be helpful for environmental reasons, but it's also potentially very profitable. So there's a business case for it. You're not often having to go against the grain. You're actually going with the grain of potentially saving consumers money, or saving companies money, or creating startups which can make money by offering a very valuable service.
So I don't know if you saw the news last week. Google has hired a philosopher. What did the experts in your book say about ethical problems we face as we create artificial intelligence and develop new devices that will further hinder our privacy, etc.?
Yeah, I think and this was not prompted by me as editor, that repeatedly there's a leitmotif that goes through many of the contributions to the book, which is generally positive about the possibilities of technology, but also concerned about the pace of change outstripping the ability of regulators to cope with what's being put in front of them. So you see that now, of course, in areas such as data privacy or cybersecurity. But in future, I think you're in particular going to see it in the area of biotechnology and what we can do with gene editing, for example. These ethical questions about what it's right to create for us to eat and what it's right to create for us to, in terms of altering the genome for health or even human advancement. The ethical questions of who gets to have access to some of the technology that is being created. These are going to be very tricky questions for all of us to deal with, and I think a philosopher and the ethics, in a way, is going to be at the forefront of business, and Google's probably ahead of its time in recognizing that.
It feels like it's late to the game. I mean, it's clearly technology is leading the world today, and for years, and I don't know if you read the book Homo Deus, but he makes this argument that religion and science need to live hand in hand, because science, left to its own devices can, destroy the world, and religion left to its own devices could destroy the world. But together, you have ethics and values together with advancement, and that's really what's necessary. And it just feels as though both, the political structure and the business structure is kind of just not really brought ethics into forefront as they should.
But it's sort of going to be unavoidable. Come back to the autonomous car. You're going to have to have decisions made by machines if you get into a position where you can't avoid a collision. Do you run over the crowd in front of you, or does the machine kill the driver? And so I don't see a way of doing that programming without an ethical dimension to the technological choices.
Is there a way that we can, push for that more in the way that companies, approach ethics? I mean, it just feels like it's not. It is, as you say, Google's at the forefront, but there seems to be many firms that just haven't even started thinking about it.
No, it's not the first thing you think about when you start up a business, and there tends to be a period, I think, of denial when you say, well, all we're trying to do is produce something that works and that people want it and so on, and then you have to confront the ethical dimension. I think it's just going to be there more and more by demand, by the fact that these issues will come to light very fast because there will be increasing scrutiny and awareness of them. And I think the difficulty is making sure you get a sensible outcome and not a knee-jerk sort of opposition to any development, and therefore some sort of holding back of potentially very advantageous technical change just out of a fear of the new.
They'd have to find a way of monetizing it so that there's an incentive to bring ethics and values into their organization. Maybe the younger generation will put a higher value on organizations that have that. I mean,
and perhaps be involved in those decisions. I mean, it's obviously these are complicated matters. You can't just say, well, we've decided what's right. I think you have to somehow engage in a conversation, both with consumers and perhaps with government and regulators, to reach a point where everybody is comfortable with the way ahead.
Back to the Future was a big series of movies a few years ago, and I think last year, if I remember correctly, it was an anniversary, and they actually said, several of these the innovations from those movies, including Biff, the president of the country, somewhat similar to some of the results that we have in today's world. So looking at the future is both interesting and entertaining. And why do you do it? I mean, you obviously wrote your previous book was Mega Change, which unravels the world 2050 in terms of economy, religion, and science. What can we gain from knowing what's to come?
Do it partly because I think it's just interesting, and it is this stepping back from the here and now, which I think is often quite revealing about what is happening today. It enables you to see sometimes what is happening today in a sort of deeper, have a deeper understanding of it, it shows it in relief. You have a clearer understanding of, oh yes, that's happening because the population is shifting or aging or growing in some part of the world and not here, and so on. So I think it's just helpful from that point of view. And then I think we are all planning our lives. We're all forecasting to some extent. We're all taking decisions as to what we think it's going to be the best way of spending our efforts and investing our time or our money or our education. So I think it is helpful to at least have a working hypothesis of how things are likely to develop, so that you can consider those choices with more information.
It's fascinating to think about. You talked about the iPhone 10 years old and the economy that was created as a result of that innovation, the app economy, the acceleration of the internet in terms of services and customized products and services around your needs, and even healthcare related apps. I mean, it's fascinating, that whole world. So knowing what lies ahead could, if you're a business leader listening to this program, could provide some inspiration for new types of businesses moving forward. Does your book have practical examples that give people pause to think and contemplate the future for their businesses?
Well, I think it points to lots of areas of technology that are going to be developing very fast, and some of the areas are not necessarily the most glamorous areas, but extremely important ones, such as I think materials science is one that sort of particularly intrigues me, that I think it's going to be producing all sorts of new materials that do extraordinary things, and is already allowing manufacturing techniques, for example, that were unthinkable a few years back, so that you can sort of almost, for example, weave together a car as BMW does in one of its factories with techniques that look more familiar to the textile industry than the traditional automotive industry. There's the whole 3D printing, which new materials plays into very well. So there's lots of sort of possibilities that are pointed to in areas of rapid development. It's not in the book, but I've sort of teased out for my own entertainment almost half a dozen sort of totally fictitious companies that encapsulate some of the new technologies, and they range from the healthcare technology in the future that you might call DKB, or Doctor Knows Best, where there's a database that has managed to accumulate all the medical case studies of history and comes up with therefore much better informed diagnosis and personalized treatments based on individuals' DNA than any doctor could individually. So it's that sort of thing where you can start to say, look, these are the sorts of possibilities that are envisaged in the book. This is the sort of company that you could imagine emerging out of it.
No, it's fascinating. I actually read an article recently about that whole area of the medical sciences and what they sort of envisioned for the future, and it was pretty remarkable. The ability to sort of cross-reference your own personal family histories with family members and all the possible implications of being in the geography you're in, what could possibly be affecting you. It's really fascinating, actually.
Yes. But there are more sort of implications for almost whichever. I think one of the fascinating things about technology is that almost whichever businesses you are in, you can imagine your life being fundamentally different in the future. So that clearly, if you're in the law, you might imagine that the competitive advantage in the future is going to lie in really smart computing, machine intelligence that will tease out the best precedents and the best arguments that have worked in the past, and do all sorts of not only the kind of e-discovery that you get at the moment, but a whole new level of sophistication combined with very finely trained legal minds. So you have this combination of smart, well-trained lawyers, but with very brilliant machinery, and the interconnection between computer science and other forms of knowledge, such as in the health industry is an obvious one, but there are other areas, is one aspect I think is going to be very fertile. The traditional barriers between disciplines will in many cases wither away.
Will we see like some of the solutions to some of these traditional political problems finally arrive? So the democratization of healthcare, through technology, access to education, things like that. Do we see that as one of the benefits of this?
Well, that is potentially one of the prizes, that it becomes much cheaper. If you could imagine, say, access to healthcare, if you imagine an app that becomes very expert at diagnosing you based on the symptoms that you describe, and perhaps even has a very lifelike interaction. We have the development today of chatbots, but you can imagine them becoming much more sophisticated, and the machine will potentially start to diagnose you very efficiently. And you could easily imagine how that sort of technology could become very, very widespread and start to make high-class diagnosis available to everyone at very little cost.
So you're a writer, an author, journalist. You chose that career at the time when the world was a bit different. What advice do you give your own children or friends if they were looking to the future for their careers? What kind of sectors should they look at? What should they be thinking about?
Well, obviously, anyone should always follow their enthusiasms, and you cannot sort of set this in stone. Interestingly, one of the questions I was asked, I thought it was a brilliant question when I went on my book tour of the United States, was what would you like your granddaughter to study? Well, I don't have a granddaughter yet, but clearly I'd be very happy if they were extremely technologically minded and were perhaps a brilliant programmer or what have you. But actually, I would be very happy if my granddaughter was a historian, because I think you will need to have this fundamental understanding of where we've come from and the things that can go wrong and what's made humanity work or not work. I think that's going to be very necessary in the future. For all the advance of technology, I think history is still going to be important.
One final question. So there seems to be two paths ahead of us. One where technology seems to help us flourish, solve some of the bigger challenges that we face, and the other future, which is darker and where the human race faces some significant challenges. Based on your expertise and that of the authors that you curated in this book, or together with them, in the most simplest terms, how do you foresee our future?
I think I'm broadly optimistic. I think that is the tone of the book. It's not a depressing read. A lot of the writing about technology can be fairly dystopian and concerned about all the negative consequences. So I think I'm broadly, as we said at the beginning, excited about the possibilities. But I think along with many of the contributors to this book, also very mindful and aware, realistic about the things that could go wrong. And the concluding chapter is all about the unintended consequences of technology. They always happen. And a very brilliant contribution by Frank Wilczek, who's a physicist at MIT and who talks about the enormous potential that the state of our knowledge of physics has created for us. Again, in a broadly positive essay, he talks about the failure modes that concern him, things like particular nuclear capability, which is already there and which we're reminded about now more and more, I think, environmental destruction, and the machines that run away with us, particularly in a military sense. So there are possibilities created by these technologies that are wondrous, but also that could be turned against us if we don't manage them very responsibly.
It's both a very positive future, but it could be quite a scary one. I actually had a meeting recently with Saul Perlmutter, who's the Nobel Prize physicist from the U.S., and he was of the opinion that we needed a new movement in the world for rational thought. That rational thought has kind of been overshadowed by pure emotion, and we really need to get back to the age of rationalism. And maybe that'll help save us as we move forward.
Well, I hope the rational thought is a very good idea, but you can't get rid of emotions. That's human.
Yeah, it's true, but at least balanced.
Yes.
But this has been fascinating. I very much appreciate, Daniel, your time today, and this has really been eye-opening to look into the future 2050 and hear your thoughts, and it's fascinating. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for joining the Uprising Pod today. If you want to find out more about who was on, or if you want to learn more about how to create your own movement, please go to scottgoodsonsuprising.com. You can also download this Uprising program from iTunes and where other leading podcasts are curated. The Uprising Pod is produced by Nicola Keneally with special help from Melanie Boardman, Karin Drachenberg, Philippa Freeman, Brianna Campbell, Farshad Faroudi, Mark Bruzy, Mark Issam, James Politi, and Jonathan Weeks. My name is Scott Goodson, and you've been listening to the Uprising Pod, where we can learn about movements and uprisings that are shaping our world, in business, in society, and in between. For more on cultural movements and movement marketing, be sure to pick up a copy of the best-selling book Uprising, How to Build a Brand and Change the World by Sparking Cultural Movements, available on Amazon.com. The music for the Uprising Pod was created by Charles Duchateau. If you have a moment, please do give us a favorable review on iTunes. so that our movement moves up the ranks of the iTunes podcast list. And if you have ideas for future shows, please let us know by going to scottgoodsonsuprising.com. Thank you, and speak to you soon.